So subsidies are a very simple area, but they're also quite controversial for a number of reasons, which we'll find out later in the presentation. So for the specification objectives, again, you need to be able to evaluate the impact, so explain what happens when a subsidy is introduced into a market, explain the pros, explain the cons, and discuss the effectiveness of these. Okay, so a subsidy is basically the opposite of an indirect tax. Rather than adding a cost to the company, what you're doing is trying to reduce the cost to producers, and this should encourage them to increase output. So it's a very level 2 sort of statement, because you're saying that a subsidy will lead to this effect. But for the exam, for level 3, so up to 12 marks in the essay, you need to be able to explain how that happens. Okay, firstly, let's look at what type of essays you'd be writing this for. So what type of problems, market failures? Well, we're really looking at anything where there's underconsumption, so wherever there's a positive externality caused, producers, consumers are not taking into account the external benefit, so they're under-consuming. And merit goods as well, where consumers don't realise the full benefit of consumption, so they just because there's some information failure, so they underconsume it as well. We could also think about public goods as well as needing subsidies, but they would need to be kind of totally subsidised, so fully subsidised, because those would be underproduced or not produced at all in a free market, because producers wouldn't be able to cover their costs because of the free riders. So let's have a look at what happens when we have a subsidy. So it's just the opposite of what happens when you have an indirect tax. It moves the supply curve outwards. And the effect that has on the equilibrium is it pushes the price down and increases the equilibrium quantity. So it causes movement along the demand curve, which increases that quantity there. So how does it work? This is really your level 3 stuff, so it's really important that you put this into an essay about subsidies. So it reduces the cost of production, it shifts supply outwards, so firms can now produce more with the resources that they have. This puts downwards pressure on the price. Now, you can put a step in between that. The reason it puts downwards pressure on the price is if the price was still up here, what would happen would be that you'd have excess supply, so you'd have kind of too much stock. So shopkeepers, would think, we need to shift some of this, let's push the price down a little bit. So that's why you're getting that step 3 there. And this causes a movement along the demand curve, because when prices are lower, we demand more. That's why demand is downward sloping, and the equilibrium quantity increases, which gets rid of this underconsumption in the market. Okay, this is just a little bit more detail for you. Don't necessarily need to know this for the exam, but it's quite interesting. So this is how much of the subsidy goes to the producer and how much goes to the consumer, and your PED, how elastic demand is, and the PES, how elastic supply is, will actually determine that share. So I'll come back to that when we're looking at the benefits and disadvantages. But just the thing to take from this, really, even if you're not going to draw this in the exam, is that not all of the subsidy gets passed on to the consumer in terms of a lower price. Okay, some of that actually is being kept by the producer. So what benefits do we have of using subsidies? So economists like it because it uses the market mechanism, so it's using the forces of demand and supply, and people respond to incentives. So when we've got a lower price, it causes that movement along the demand curve. Another factor as well, you've got to think about what it is that you're subsidising, but in past essays there have been questions on should the government subsidise food prices and things like that, or housing. And the interesting thing about food and housing is that they represent basic needs. So if you're thinking about a government being able to subsidise a product that is a basic need might be quite beneficial for your country in terms of fulfilling, basic living standards and things like that as well. Now, of course, some people are going to benefit from this that would have been able to afford to pay the full price. So we call that kind of a blanket subsidy. So that could be, you could have that last factor and say, well, that's good, but it does lead on to this case of blanket subsidies, which, is it right that someone's getting a discount who could have afforded it, who has a lot of money? Wouldn't that money have been better spent elsewhere? So there's that element of opportunity cost. In terms of problems, there's quite a few actually. Firstly, it cushions firms against competition. So this is one of the big negatives of using subsidies, because subsidies would be decided on by a kind of government by government basis. Now, the governments that are able to give bigger subsidies, because it's obviously going to be quite expensive, are richer countries. So like the EU, like the US. And then when we're competing in an international market against countries where they just can't really afford to give huge subsidies, our products look a lot cheaper in price because they've got these big subsidies on them, and then they may sell more because demand is downward sloping. And you gain this kind of unfair advantage, which it can be very, very harmful for developing countries. It can also be quite harmful for the firm. There's not really any incentive to work harder or become more efficient if you're cushioned against competition from other countries at least. This second problem, this is the same when we're looking at solving negative externalities with indirect taxes. It's really hard to determine the exact level of subsidy that you should apply to cover the external benefit of the activity, because these external benefits are probably things that don't always have monetary value. So if I'm thinking about the benefits of more housing, the external benefits of that, what would they be? Kind of, I don't know. Imagine you could think of some parents thinking, oh, it must be far less stressful having your children like live in their own house when they're in their 30s than live at home. But you can't go into a shop and say, can I have the stress-free feeling of having my children having left home, or something like that. It's not something that's traded on market. So actually working out the monetary value of these external benefits is going to be quite difficult, and then you lead on to problems if you don't get it right. You maybe cause too much consumption, or there's still this positive externality happening. This third point is going back to that diagram that I showed you. The subsidy may be absorbed by the producer, so more of the subsidy might be going to the producer, and then that links back to that first point. It's really cushioning them against competition, and it's the benefits not really being passed on to the consumer. And it's also the effectiveness is going to depend upon price elasticity of demand. And I think I've got two diagrams here. So we can see when we're looking at price elasticity of demand, we're looking at subsidies. We're trying to solve underconsumption. So what we're really interested in is how much can it affect the quantity, the equilibrium quantity at the bottom. So here we have, these are the same size subsidies, but we can see here that it's when demand is inelastic, it's far less effective than when demand is elastic. So price elasticity of demand will have an effect on the effectiveness of your subsidy. Okay, so what could we use as an alternative? Well, we could use regulation. We could say you either, enforce consumption. So, for example, with schools, you have to attend school, or you have to have some form of provision, homeschooling, and the government check up on those things. It could be cheaper to use than a subsidy. Okay, student interrupted then, I don't know where I am. Okay, so enforcing someone to do something could work better than a subsidy because it'd be cheaper. It'd be you have to, for example, wear a seatbelt. That's cheaper than paying people to wear a seatbelt. But if you think about education, the example I used before, we have regulation that says that children have to attend education, but we also subsidise it heavily, so it's free mostly. So they work in partnership. It's not just one or the other a lot of the time. And a negative against regulation is, I think as economists, we think that actually rewards work better than having rules, but I've put a question mark there. It's up for debate, really. But there are quite a few tests that show that rewarding people for good behaviour works better than necessarily punishing them for bad behaviour. Okay, another alternative would be to provide education information. This is really thinking about merit goods. So you're getting to the root cause of the problem, which caused the information failure, so the underconsumption. But then again, will it be enough of an incentive? When we think about smoking or drinking alcohol, people know that it's not good for them. People know about the harmful effects that it can cause, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they don't engage in that type of behaviour. So it might be that, you know, it's not really, you know, a kind of problem of information failure. It's just a problem of self-restraint. Okay, so if we're looking at a essay question, this was a few exams ago, discuss whether subsidising the building of affordable new houses is the most effective solution to a housing shortage, for 18 marks. So level 1 to 4 marks, your definitions in there. So you might want to define what a subsidy is. You might want to also question, why are we subsidising this? So you've got to get to the root cause of the problem, you know. And in the case study, it was talking about housing shortage as being a problem because you know, having housing causes lots of positive externalities for certain areas. So it's underconsumption there. Explain how it works for level 2, so saying that it increases the production, saying that it increases the equilibrium quantity, but for level 3 you need to explain how it does that and any benefits of doing that. Biggest benefit is obviously going to be that you're going to increase consumption, so get rid of that problem of underconsumption. And explain the negatives, which we've just been through, and explain either what does it depend upon, the success of this. You know, I would question, you know, affordable new houses. Is everybody allowed to purchase these? Because most of these new schemes where the government is subsidising affordable new homes, you have to meet certain criteria, so your income has to be under a certain level, which sort of is a way of checking the people that get these houses are the people most in need of these houses, because you could just get developers buying up these affordable new houses and you know, or people having second homes. You know, is it really going to solve the shortage for the people that most need it? Or you could look at the alternatives, which we've just looked at there. And obviously education information is not going to work so well for this one, because that we're looking at positive externalities really. So specification objectives, we've got to evaluate the impact of subsidies as a solution to market failure. So remembering it's moving the supply curve to the right, it's reducing the market price, and it is increasing the equilibrium quantity, which solves a problem of underconsumption. And then you've got to discuss the effectiveness, look at some alternatives, look at the benefits and the disadvantages.